Opening the center immediately offers exciting tactical possibilities and aims for rapid development. Replicating white's central pawn establishes immediate symmetry and contests the crucial square. Instantly challenging black's central pawn, this knight leap unifies piece development and prepares castling, hinting at aggressive intentions. Solidifies the central pawn, prepares for queen development, and eyes the e4 pawn, a standard and robust response. Initiating the Ruy-Lopez, this bishop's sortie immediately pressures black's knight, creating a subtle spatial advantage and setting the stage for a protracted positional struggle. Challenging the bishop's influence directly, black immediately seeks to clarify the pawn structure and potential bishop trade, setting a clear strategic direction. Retreating the bishop preserves the pin and prepares kingside development, maintaining pressure on the center. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside development, but potentially allowing white's pieces more influence. Simplifying the pawn structure opens lines for your pieces and prepares for central expansion, aiming to exploit black's weakened queenside. Opening the b-file for your rook is a promising positional concession, as doubled pawns often hinder piece development and create weaknesses later. Suddenly, the center opens, inviting immediate skirmishes and demanding precise piece placement from both sides. Undermining your pawn structure for a seemingly open king only invites trouble, as it creates weaknesses that white's pieces can exploit relentlessly. Developing the bishop to the center subtly improves its scope, eyeing the d4 pawn and indirectly pressuring black's queenside pawn structure, a consequence of the earlier capture. This maneuver bravely ventures the knight to a less active square, potentially eyeing a central redistribution later, though it temporarily surrenders central influence and leaves the king's side somewhat less guarded. Developing another knight to its natural square reinforces control over the center and prepares for a potential kingside assault, while also opening up lines for the queen. Developing the bishop to bd7 solidifies the pawn chain and readies for potential queenside expansion, but it does obstruct the c-pawn's path and relinquishes some control over the central squares, which white is aggressively claiming with d4. Unleashing the queen, white aims to capitalize on black's somewhat passive development, preparing for potential kingside action and reinforcing the d4 pawn. This queen repositioning seeks to activate a key piece and create more dynamic threats down the center, while anticipating black's attempts to challenge white's central control. A peculiar retreat for the queen. Instead of immediately contesting the central tension, this maneuver prepares to redeploy the queen to the kingside, perhaps aiming to support a future pawn advance or to escape potential tactics on the queen side. It surrenders the c-file temporarily, but might be setting a subtle trap. Unleashing the king's defense to the queen side initiates a dynamic imbalance, setting the stage for a sharp positional struggle where pawn structure weaknesses for black's doubled c-pawns will be a long-term consideration versus white's more flexible setup. Releasing the central tension is a pragmatic decision, accepting a slightly altered pawn structure in exchange for immediate piece activity. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately injects dynamism into the center, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's castled king. Shifting the knight to g6, a somewhat unusual square, aims to contest the central d4 pawn and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm, while simultaneously avoiding the immediate pressure from white's queen and knight. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, white aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and seize control of the d-file, while simultaneously potentially opening lines for their own attacking pieces and creating a more aggressive pawn chain. The queen embarks on a surprisingly passive journey, seemingly shying away from the central melee white is aggressively pursuing. Instead of seeking active post or challenging white's burgeoning pawn center, it retreats to a more defensive square, potentially hindering its own development and allowing white further freedom to consolidate their advantage. Reasserting central pressure, this knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's cramped queenside pawn structure and potentially eye the kingside if the opportunity arises. Embracing the central pawn structure, and developing the remaining minor piece streamlines black's coordination, preparing for a potential kingside expansion while also fortifying the king's shelter. Preparing to expand on the queenside, white subtly reinforces the kingside pawn structure while aiming to control the crucial d5 square, potentially leading to a pawn majority there later if black's defenses falter. Finally securing the king behind a wall of pawns and pieces, black aims to consolidate after a series of exchanged blows, preparing to join the central struggle. Unleashing a pawn storm, white boldly advances the g-pawn, seeking to pry open the kingside for a decisive attack, though this aggressive thrust simultaneously creates potential weaknesses around his own monarch. Stepping back with the rook, black prepares to contest the d-file, a crucial artery now bleeding into white's castled position. This is a subtle but important repositioning, acknowledging white's aggressive pawn thrust with g4 and ensuring the rook isn't passively trapped on the queenside while white builds a dangerous attack. Pushing the f-pawn here boldly challenges black's kingside structure, aiming to disrupt their coordination and potentially open lines towards the castled monarch. It's a decisive declaration of intent, but one that simultaneously creates a weakness on the g-file that could be exploited if black defends accurately. The knight's repositioning to e5 creates a pivotal tactical nexus, aiming to exploit the open f-file and potentially threaten the overextended white king. This dynamic maneuver signals black's intent to seize the initiative, challenging white's dominant central pawn structure and seeking counterplay through active piece placement, a refreshing change from passive defense. Opening up lines in the center with the knight exchange significantly alters the pawn structure, creating isolated doubled pawns for black on the c-file while potentially freeing white's pieces for central activity. Black solidifies the pawn structure after the exchange on e5, establishing a more resilient central presence and preparing to contest the open d-file. Unlocking the kingside potential and building towards a central pawn push marks this queen's repositioning, aiming to support the advancing f-pawn and prepare for an eventual g5 advance. Recognizing the doubled pawns on the queenside as a potential weakness, black aims to consolidate and prepare for queenside counterplay by repositioning the queen. Suddenly, the king finds itself under fire on the queenside diagonal, a consequence of black's pawn structure and white's coordinated pieces, forcing an immediate decision and potentially disrupting any defensive setup. Seeking shelter, black tucks the monarch away on the side, a defensive measure driven by the pressure building on the kingside, where white's advancing pawns have created immediate weaknesses. Reinforcing the dark square control in the center, this maneuver also prepares to activate the bishop along the a2-g8 diagonal, aiming for potential pressure on black's king and the weakened c6 pawn structure. Reclaiming the semi-open b-file with the rook is a sensible ambition, aiming to challenge white's queenside initiative and potentially disrupt the harmony of their pieces, especially if white continues to neglect their own queenside defense and allows a pawn storm to develop on the kingside. Asserting dominance on the queenside, the knight gallops to a4, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and I-squares like c5, potentially creating a powerful outpost. Liberating the bishop from its pedestrian post, this maneuver aims to activate the piece and challenge white's centralized knight, potentially opening lines for counterplay and creating new avenues of attack towards the castled king. Disrupting black's queenside pawn structure is the immediate aim, aiming to create weaknesses that can be exploited later. A crucial pawn recapture, cxd6*, fundamentally alters the structural landscape, opening the c-file for potential future pressure while solidifying black's central pawn presence, though it does commit the pawn forward and creates a slightly less harmonious pawn chain on the queenside. Unleashing the rook onto the open d-file marks a decisive shift, now targeting black's vulnerable queenside pawn structure. This maneuver attempts to activate the bishop, but it concedes significant central control, potentially allowing white's pieces to dominate the kingside and exploit the weakened pawn structure around black's monarch. Focusing the queen onto the c-file, white aims to exploit the open lines created and pressure black's weakened queenside pawn structure. Trading off white's active rook frees black from immediate pressure on the d-file, simplifying the position and aiming to consolidate the material equality. The rook now claims the open d-file, aiming to exploit the isolated pawn and potentially create mating threats along the third rank. A desperate attempt to create some breathing room on the king side, though it does little to address the inherent weaknesses that white has meticulously exploited. The pawn structure is now quite compromised, and this pawn advance doesn't really contribute to development or active piece play. Instead, it might actually serve to highlight the king's precarious position by opening up potential lines for white's pieces. Establishing a flexible pawn structure that supports a potential queenside expansion. Maintaining the king's safety in the face of an exposed position now becomes paramount, a subtle shift towards defensive fortification after the recent exchanges. Preparing an assault on the king side by opening the h-file, though black's monarch seems quite insulated for the moment. Challenging the center with this pawn thrust is a bold decision, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces after white recaptures. Opening up lines towards black's beleaguered monarch, the knight boldly ventures into enemy territory, aiming to exploit the now open kingside diagonal. Suddenly, the queen abandons its defensive post, seeking counterplay on the queen side and potentially aiming to disrupt white's rook on d6. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, white aims to pry open lines and exploit the black king's cramped quarters, a bold gambit to seize the initiative after a period of positional jockeying. Unleashing a bishop's long-range potential along the open diagonal, the defender aims to disrupt white's attacking momentum by creating immediate threats against the monarch. Opening the g-file immediately creates attacking potential, leveraging the weakened pawn structure on black's kingside, and potentially exposing the king if black doesn't react with precision. A desperate attempt to ignite counterplay on the queen side, hoping to exploit white's slightly exposed king and potentially regain some dynamic balance by opening lines. Unleashing a relentless barrage on the king side, the queen now ventures deep into enemy territory, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and create immediate threats against the uncastled monarch. A bold recapture, this rook deployment initiates a tense confrontation on the open f-file, immediately challenging white's aggressive pawn advance and potentially exposing their king's defenses to a swift counterattack. A masterful maneuver to seize the open file, threatening to infiltrate black's defenses and expose the king. Abandoning the already compromised queen's side, the rook galvanizes for a potential foray into the white king's territory, aiming to disrupt the delicate balance white has painstakingly established. A daring recapture initiating a crucial exchange, white boldly sacrifices material temporarily to dismantle black's already precarious pawn shield and expose the monarch. Unlocking counterplay and seeking an escape route, this pawn advance aims to stir up black's dormant queen and potentially disrupt white's rook on the first rank. Shifting the rook to the king side opens up fresh attacking avenues, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed black monarch and potentially create mating threats with the queen and remaining rook working in tandem. Seeking to untangle the cramped queen side and activate the misplaced queen, black repositions to a4, aiming to challenge the dominant white rook and potentially probe weaknesses on the king side. Securing the monarch's sanctuary becomes the immediate priority, shifting focus from the exposed white squares to a more robust defensive posture for the king. A daring thrust, aiming to seize the initiative on the queen side and potentially expose white's king through the c-file, a bold attempt to disrupt the otherwise solid queenside structure. Unleashing a pawn storm, white pushes forward, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure and expose the king. Unlocking the kingside has been white's primary objective, and this pawn push aggressively attempts to cleave open lines of attack, forcing black into a defensive posture and potentially exposing the black monarch. Unlocking the d-file with the rook repositioning aims to challenge black's defensive structure directly, potentially exposing their king to further threats down the open file. The bishop's repositioning to g6 finally unblocks the f7 pawn, setting up a potential counterattack down the g-file or offering a crucial defensive posture. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, this ambitious push seeks to shatter black's defensive shell, aiming to create critical weaknesses around the king by gaining vital space. Sacrificing the bishop opens the h-file and creates a dangerous new attacking avenue for black's pieces, directly threatening white's uncastled king and potentially leading to a swift mating attack if white is not careful with their defense. The white monarch is now exposed to a piercing diagonal, forcing a rapid response to prevent further penetration. The king finds itself exposed to a sudden crossfire of threats. The immediate need is to disrupt the attacking queen's positional dominance and create defensive resources. Unleashing a decisive rook check, white aims to break through black's defenses and hunt down the exposed king.